tired of using it, as other people have started to use it. GE, Verizon, they're all talking about building a smart city for cities. And Ben Levine mentioned last night, and I've seen this as well, there's an amazing time, I'm not even going to say what city it was, this woman got up from another city and said, "We have a smart city." And she paused, as if we all knew what that meant. And it turned out what that meant was they signed a contract with Sprint, and Sprint has put smart furniture all over their city. And she then said, "We want to know what to do with it now." And so I have a real issue with this. We have a magical set of technologies that's new and it's fancy and it's the future and it sounds like something out of the Jetsons, and so we should do it, right? And I want to flip it around because unfortunately they've grabbed two really important words, smart and cities. And so I want to flip it to maybe it's really just about cities being smart or cities that are smart, right? And so then what does it mean to be smart? And if I think about that as an educator, being smart is being able to gather information, to process it, to make sense of it, to connect information from multiple sources, to synthesize it into new insights, and to be able to leverage it for creative and dynamic problem solving, right? That's what being smart is as a person, right? When you think of someone who is smart, that's kind of what you picture. Someone who knows a lot of stuff, but also can take action on that stuff when faced with a challenge or a problem or an opportunity to do so. And I really think we've gotten to see that in the last day and a half. And from my perch in BARI, and I mean the fact that I get to talk to all of you with some regularity and see what you're all doing, I feel like we see this across Boston constantly, right? Whether we're talking about different groups coming up with plans for the way infrastructure will handle the consequences of climate change, or we're talking about the state connecting multiple types of data sets to try to better understand the opioid epidemic, or as we're watching gentrification occur across the city, how do we actually measure and define and explain gentrification before we jump to a conclusion of what the right policy or practice measure is? Right? The city of Boston, the police department, releasing field interrogation observation data to better understand its interaction with its racial subpopulations, and being willing to have that conversation. I mean, think about how many police departments in the country are willing to have that conversation. And so I really think that we are at a moment in Boston where I think what we excel in, that some of our colleagues at other cities have, and some of them don't have as much of, is we excel at being smart in terms of being proactive in how do we get information, how do we turn it into value, how do we do something with it rather than putting the cart before the horse. And I think that this is especially illustrated in the city's Smart City RFI, where instead of signing a 6, 7, 8-figure contract with a company that will give you a smart city, they wanted to hear from all of these different companies, what can you do for us that will make our city more smart? What can you do that will make our city more effective and efficient? And so that's my kind of two-pronged answer to this question, my national anxiety, but my optimism and hope here, and especially my hope that through contacts like the MetroLab Network and others, we can help to kind of lead this nationally and have others learn with us.
Okay, is this working? Yeah, okay. So, I think we've served up a provocative panel. And I want to open it up, make sure we have time for questions from the floor, but maybe rather than take 10 minutes, we can just take 5, maybe a little conversation among the panelists. I just wanted to ask one question or two, and in some respects they've been covered a little bit, but to start with Evan, and I'm kind of like Dan, I'm in the middle. It's obviously provocative, but I guess one thing I think about is that we're in this hopefully a temporary position, right? I mean, in the sense of the argument being made is, okay, what's happening right now, and yes, there's been a decline in institutional trust, but we don't want to assume necessarily that the trajectory will continue, at least that it's steep slope. Just thinking in the long run, in particular about about it historically, and then we'll talk about and how you might think about that. Secondly, I think it might be the case that it's not data necessarily, but it's the kind of data, right? It's not just data per se, and I think, at least in the political context, I believe one can make the argument that you care a lot about data, it's just which kinds of data. For example, if Trump's tax returns were released tomorrow, I think that data would be really effective, and they care a lot about that data. Now, that serves to support the notion of there's a politicization here, but nonetheless, I think we need to contextualize the data. Thirdly, the argument came up about the locality, you know, mayors rule the world and so on and so forth. Dan pointed out that, well, when it comes to something like climate change, maybe that argument doesn't quite hold, but on the other hand, for a lot of what we're talking about, and this goes to what Andrew's presentation was about, in terms of the importance of cities. In fact, I think cities would respond in part by saying, well, but we care about data. We've got to run the damn place, and this matters a lot. So while, you know, the federal government may be bloating and dysfunctional, cities, at least at some fundamental level, can act. And then finally, the idea of availability bias. I totally agree with that. And I was wondering to what extent, though, that can potentially be addressed. And I think that's something that, for example, Dan, some of us at BARI have argued, not perfectly, but through proper understanding of the mechanisms by which data are produced. I think that's what's often missed out there, is a piece of data from the government doesn't necessarily mean anything absent context and absent a model that, in essence, refines that, and that's what we've attempted to do. And maybe Dan can say a minute or two about that. So, how about we just take, however you'd like to respond, either to what I said or to what anyone on the panel has said. Maybe take a minute, 2 max, and then we'll open it up to the audience.
So since I only have a minute, I'll just do it the first thing you said. I think if it is a temporary issue, it's a temporary issue that has exposed a permanent problem. The permanent problem being you can't rely on the good faith of the current office holder to guarantee the integrity of data. You need to put in place institutions that operate effectively, irrespective of the good faith or bad faith. And I don't think that's, I think we spend a lot of time talking about how to make data better and not enough time talking about how to improve the institutions so that the long-term prospect for data is better.
Well, I probably won't need a whole minute because I think I spent 15 doing that. But I do want to actually respond to that specific point, which is I think you're presenting this idea that we need institutions to take the politics out of data. I'm just wondering how those institutions don't themselves become political. I mean, isn't it a political statement to say we need these institutions and we need transparency and we need that to be a guaranteed thing?
I'm not saying take the politics out. I'm saying take the lead politicians out. That is, I'm saying they have to be insulated from the people who currently hold executive power. Not that they have to be insulated from ideology. They're not going to be insulated from ideology. They can still be insulated from executive authority.
But how do you get them without having?
Well, you have it at the national.
No, this is.
I mean, you have it at the national level. You do have. You have walls that are put up between appointed positions and long-serving career positions. You have, here would be a test. The data organizations have to be comfortable releasing information that is deeply damaging to those in power. And Census can do that, and the Labor Department can do that, and I'm not convinced that data organizations in the state and the city can do that.
But the census, for example, is not isolated from the political winds. For example, in 2010, the deal that had to be reached to even confirm Bob Gates as the census director basically prohibited the census from using any kind of sampling-based techniques in conducting the census, because ultimately there's great awareness that there's a problem there, which is that low-income and minority communities are underrepresented in the census if you're obliging that everybody responds on an individual level. And so what would make sense if you're doing any other kind of survey would be to say, okay, we know that these particular locations or groups or what have you are underrepresented. Let's make adjustments to account for that knowledge. But the census isn't allowed to do that, because if they did that, it would basically increase the share of population that goes to areas that typically elect Democrats.
I'm very surprised to hear you making this sort of postmodern argument that because politics is everywhere, we should try to do nothing to insulate ourselves against it. It strikes me that even if there are cracks, there's a big difference between a house with some cracks in the window and a house missing a wall. And insulating politics doesn't remove it, but there are still things we can do, and I wouldn't want to ally to the difference between those.
So I want to jump in on this, because I'm not. But I do have another answer to Rob's question about kind of data availability bias. I think of the Congressional Budget Office as sort of the analog in some sense of what you're getting at here, right? It's a bipartisan thing that releases reports that hypothetically are objective. Now it gets politicized, right? So did they do a full analysis of whether trickle-down economics works or not? And did that get kind of buried by the Republicans? Yeah, that happened. And are they going to try to undermine their comments about what's going to happen with the AHCA? Yeah, that's going to happen. But I think what's telling, and I think what puts us in a difficult position at the moment, is at some point in time, both parties and all political actors were in agreement that budget matters, right? That you couldn't disagree with the fact that budget is important. And so then that gives the bipartisan motivation to create a bipartisan body. And if we've already partisanized data, it makes it very difficult to have bipartisan motivation to create a bipartisan body that makes data kind of sacrosanct. I mean, part of the problem is one of the parties in question here doesn't want data, and so you have difficulty. Now, could we do that at a municipal level? It's possible. I don't entirely know how you play that chess game out to its end, but it's possible. On a completely different note, to what Rob was asking about with availability bias, I think it's really interesting. So I'm going to channel my inner Sandy Pettin right now, because I got to have dinner with him last night, and so I can actually quote a study that he's working on, and that really relates to this. And so he's doing this project in Africa, and I think he's replicating it in Bogota. And what they've done is they've partnered with municipalities and with telecoms in those municipalities to basically use cell phone records, right? Cell phone metadata, right? When does a tower ping? In order to track certain indicators. And what's really interesting about the project is that it's essentially leveraging telecom data, our classic big data, in order to replace all of the missing data institutions in that particular society. And so I'm not saying that this is a catch-all, right? This isn't a panacea, but there is so much data and so much information out there. Do we have to think creatively about how you create heuristic measures out of other data sets to try to get a full picture, right? I'll even plug a project we're working on right now. It's being led by, I think Talia's still back there, Talia Kaufman, who's a graduate student working with us at BARI, where she is scraping Google Place data to find out where Google thinks all places are. And we're also working with the city's business license data, and we're mapping them against each other. Turns out they don't know all the same information, which is really interesting, right? So the commercial landscape of the city is different according to those two sources, but if you start to combine them and you think about where the blind spots in one are vis-a-vis the other, you start to get a fuller understanding of not only your actual landscape, but also the nature of availability bias, and you can start to control for that.
Okay, great. So this is fantastic. We can keep going, but do want to end at 5 or a few minutes after so we can go to the reception. So we have a schedule to follow. But I propose the following. We have a few minutes left. If there's questions from the audience, why don't we take them? And what I propose is that we collect questions rather than going back and forth, because otherwise I don't know, spool into not everyone being able to ask questions. So if there are any, we'll just collect them now and then take 5 to 7 minutes to answer, and then we'll break for the reception. So is there anything, comments from the floor here first? Yes?
Trying to make my question brief. As an urban planning scholar and the average voter, consumer of information. And as much as I am an enormous fan of what cities like Boston and BARI and other collective efforts are doing, I fear it's becoming another elite conversation, and that it makes it easy to dismiss data as fake news and just not seen as relevant by most people.
Anything else? Okay, one more quick.
I know that so I work for the Boston Police Department, and I do feel that there's a lot of constraints on city agencies, data offices, in that we have these mandates to get things back within 10 days and to do all this kind of big things with sort of cleaning and redacting data before we can get out. So I think part of it, and I'm probably speaking to the journalists more, is that a lot of times these mandates do not come with funding, and we don't have staff. So the majority of the people in my office are funded with grant funds from, let's say, the federal and state government, and then to do very specific project-related things. They're not operating budget positions. And so sometimes it is a matter of, especially since we have to keep confidentiality and personal identifying factors out of much of police data, is that you have to go through these long drawn processes of redacting, identifying information, and yet they don't give you staff. So and I think that I'm speaking from one office, but you have legislation that's passed that says you got to do X, Y, and Z, and you got to do it now. And then another thing of legislation will happen, and another thing of legislation. None of this legislation comes with money. So behind those requests, there's nobody there to then run around and try to be a big data person and prepare it in a way that then you give it to any audience. So sometimes it's not political. It's a matter of not having the staff to be able to do that for requesting agencies. But also specific to police stuff, the confidentiality around every piece of data. So yeah, we don't have someone's name in there, but you also have to take out address, and you have to take out identifying factors, data borough data, all of it. And this is manual. This is magic marker stuff. So I just want to put that out there, because if we're struggling with it, I'm sure other city agencies are also struggling with it. So while things are going really fast and big up here in the big data world, you still have people that are sitting behind desks that are still in the dark ages around the ability to take old, antiquated, paper-driven systems and try to be transparent with limited staff and dysfunctional computer data systems at times. So I just want to get out there, because that is part of the reality that may have nothing to do with not wanting to be open and transparent, but it could be structural and staff resource. One of the issues.
Okay, so a lot of stuff, and we're already after 5. So why don't we each take like 30 seconds to respond? But remember, there's a reception, so we can continue the conversation. So that's what I propose, that we think about this. And I'm going to continue just briefly, and I'll model the 30 seconds. Starting with Mr. Schiff's question, which is a good one in terms of data and information, in terms of the production of collective efficacy and sort of the ingredient of residents taking ownership of community in the sense of social control and trust. I think 2 things I would say to that. One thing we know from research is that institutions matter a lot for collective efficacy in communities, and actually relates to Evan's point. So it's not just data, right? It's institutions, and the data and information, I think, is a two-edged sword. If we look at some of what we've learned from private sort of social networks for neighborhoods, information can be used to the benefit of individuals, not for the public good. We know that. It can even be used in terms of things like profiling. On the other hand, it can be used to disseminate information, whether it's an emergency, to provide help for people. One of the presentations here today showing that neighborhoods that are more networked are better able to respond to challenges. So to the extent that information and data trust in the institutions and the providers of those data, I think, are crucial. More to say about that, but I won't.
I'll run through my answers. First, no, I have no confidence that the fourth estate can serve as a useful arbiter. I wish I had more confidence for a couple of reasons. People inside the newsroom aren't equipped to do it. My colleagues aren't equipped to do it. And the news environment is increasingly about interest rather than those readers, about clickbait and whatnot. So, and then there's a lack of faith in media in general. So, no, I don't have much confidence in that. I'm sensitive to your suggestion that, in fact, there are resource problems. That's why the example I picked both were cases where they had the data. Sure that there are others, although I also think I would say that's probably a problem we should take up with city council and the legislature, because you need those resources. And then on the data literacy, yeah, I think people are pretty tribal, and that's one of the reasons that institutions and trust are primary, because it's not, even for people, I mean, it's easy to like reject this idea, but even for people like us who are pretty sophisticated with data, we have a ton of biases that come from just wanting to agree with the people around us, and I think most everybody has that, and that is also about social networks and institutions.
So I will try to answer 3 questions in one long thought. So to start with the first question about economic data, my answer is not going to satisfy me, and it probably won't satisfy you, but I think for us, our focus starts with what the city government does or what interactions it has with the public. So that's a really hard challenge for us, is the more outward-facing what's going on in our communities, because you're absolutely right about the federal government providing a lot of that. And I think for us, it's a challenge to figure out where it is that we can add value and contribute. It's something that I don't have a clear answer for, but it's something that's important for us to go beyond just seeing what we're doing to what's going on throughout Boston. That's a question we are definitely going to have to answer. But on the topic of what it is that we do focus on, well, we do focus on the interactions with the community, in part because that's what gives us a workable data ecosystem. So the simplest example of this is our 311 system, where when somebody reports something, we find it incredibly important to make sure that we follow up. Sometimes that gets as perhaps cheesy as getting a picture of not only the pothole that got filled, but the crew that did it, standing alongside it. But the idea here is we're trying to set high expectations that that's what you should get out of government. And going to a slightly higher level, when I was talking about that crash prediction project, one of the ideas there is we solicited responses from the public about what are the hazardous things on our streets that we should do something about. We got more than 5,000 responses, and one of the ideas here is we want to show that, hey, we're not just putting these on a map and sharing them with other people and not doing anything. We're using this in something that is leading to us directly trying to address these big problems. And that leads into the last point about data literacy, because what we want to do in all of this is to show that data is not some abstract thing for a bunch of nerds sitting in a university hall. We're really making this about what's going on throughout the city. And so the irony of bringing it all back around about talking about institutions is, I think, why I get so worked up about this. I think we're trying to create an institution in a way, with our work around open data and transparency, to set a much higher expectation of government for what they provide. Because if we now in this administration start providing these kinds of things and this kind of responsive service to the public, then if we make it something that people who aren't just in this room but throughout the community care about and are deeply invested in, then if it goes away in the future, there will be a cost to that. Whereas if it's just narrowly kept amongst ourselves, then these kinds of things can happen and nobody really gets that upset. So I think the key to creating an institution is this data literacy component, where we need to get enough of the public to care about data before we can expect that we're going to have it consistently and with a high degree of quality as something that we never have to worry about again.
So I stand between you and wine and cheese. So I'm going to be very brief. And I'm really just going to answer kind of an amalgam of Russell's question, Linda's question, which is communities and data. And I've been spending a lot of time thinking about this lately for various reasons. But really, I think we've figured out to some extent what the city-university collaboration model looks like. I mean, we're learning still, and we're trying to perfect it, but we have a good idea of how to make it happen. It fits and starts at least. But I don't think we have any real grasp on a city-university community, right? There's this vast amount of information out there that's proliferating rather rapidly, and still, I mean, this has been touched on about 15 times today, either directly or indirectly. Like 99% of the population has no idea how to engage with that information. And we had an interesting meeting last year with a group of community organizations about this problem. And so we've been doing these community-based trainings in our Boston data portal, right? We create these measures that are relatively interpretable from big data, and we publish them. And we had this meeting with these community organizations asking them, how do we get to the public? And their answer, and being people who work with the public regularly, and so I trust them, was, you don't. The public doesn't care. The public aren't nerds, right? They're not geeks. They don't really want to play with data. They're not necessarily all that interested. And so then they were arguing that what we really need to do is just make it so community organizations, at least, who have access to working with the public, identifying opportunities for public value, they become the infomediary. They become the in-between that can do that work. And so it's still an experiment, right? I don't think we've solved it. In fact, I think that the panel before this, right, so Raul's work with data murals is really provocative, and it's really sort of, it's lesson learning, if you will, right? I don't know that Raul's work is scalable yet because you're required with a data mural, which takes a lot of work, but I think there's a lot of lessons out there that we need to figure out how do we bring this to the grassroots. With that, Rob, do you want to say last words, or should I just give tell people where to go?
Thank you, and thank the panel, and thank everybody for coming. It's been a terrific day and a half. Thank you.
So I do need to give you guys operational instructions. The reception is up the stairs in the McHugh Suites. Yeah,